Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of He's Not Wrong. I'm your host, Chad D, and I'm joined by one of our favorite repeat guests, Dr. Benjamin Arnberg. You probably remember him from a few episodes ago. We were drinking wine, we were talking about AI, we were talking about higher education. It was one of my longest episodes, and yet we still had a lot of content that we cut out, and I am breaking the fourth wall because I'm looking over here. Grab your wine glass.
Yeah.
So if you're watching on YouTube, reach it like this way. Like towards me.
Oh, I see.
See, there's his hand. He is in the same room with me, and we have two separate cameras. So if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I do recommend that you go check out YouTube because the setup is pretty exquisite, if I do say so myself. But we are joined by Ben. I need to lay the groundwork for how this episode came to be, because this is the first episode of 2026. I had really high hopes. I have been teasing that the quality is going to go up. We have a lot of guests, that the first guest of 2026 was going to lay the groundwork for all the upcoming episodes thereafter. I have a really big episode on Tuesday that I'm recording, and today's guest was supposed to kind of be the lead-in for that, and he forgot. So we're kind of scrambling here. Ben lives in my building, and he was already going to come on and do this intro with me, but he will be getting this entire episode to himself. So, Ben, we're just going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask what you're not wrong about, if you don't mind filling us in.
Okay, so the news of the day today was Venezuela. I really didn't have that much thought about what was going on in Venezuela, other than just kind of basically keeping track of what was going on with the targeted attacks of the boats and things like that. But I will have to say that I'm not wrong, and that I'm not surprised at this escalation. I think in many ways this is one of those tests that the administration is trying to give to the legal system to see just how far it can go, as far as exerting executive authority with or without congressional approval. I think that plays a big role in this. And it's also why it's Venezuela as the target, because Venezuela has historically not been a particularly strong ally of the United States, or even a popular cause within the United States. It's always been kind of a punching bag. So it makes a good candidate for targeting for this type of attack or this type of incident, as a test case for, is the Supreme Court going to let me just go over congressional authority and assert this kind of militaristic attack without getting congressional approval first. So I think that's a big part of why it is. I mean, there's a lot of speculation, is it really about, what was the charge? Drug terrorism was one of the charges. Is it really about that? Some people have said it's really about oil supply and oil reserves. That's one of it. But I think, too, an underlying motivation is, can we use this as a case to take all the way up to the Supreme Court to see just how much leeway they're going to give the executive branch for the next 3 years for us to do other things?
Yeah. So if you're listening and you haven't been made aware of Venezuela yet, which I hope you have, because we have a lot of other issues that need to be talked about if you are unaware of what happened in Venezuela. But overnight, Trump did some strategic strikes in Venezuela. They captured the president and his wife, brought them to the U.S., and they're going to try them in the U.S. Court system on drug charges and whatever. And so the conversation here is, as Ben said, oil. That's like the underlying thing. Like, this isn't about drugs, it's about oil. But the thing that they really did a good job at is muddying the water leading up to this, because the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Machado, there was an election in 2024 in Venezuela as well. And Maria Machado essentially won the election. And it was, she won pretty much 2-1. And it's just ironic that Trump is wanting to say, you have this dictator, we need regime change. Maria Machado is the rightful presidential winner, which I'm not arguing that is actually true, but he's acting like he cares about this stuff when we've seen how he has handled elections, how he has handled losses, how he has handled all of that in America. And so it just doesn't make sense. Why would he care about it down there? And it doesn't make sense. It is about oil. So Ben, yeah, you're not wrong about that.
Yeah, there's one other thing too, as far as the charges. I already mentioned drug terrorism was one of the charges. There was a second one, and then the third one was possession of machine guns, which I find pretty comical because, of course, possession of machine guns, nobody really cares about in the United States. I mean, people have them all the time, and we have done very little to prosecute on that front. And yet that's one of the three major charges that's being placed on Maduro. So I read that and just almost guffawed because I was like, how American to be like, you shall not have machine guns. Meanwhile, you can just about buy them in the supermarket here. It's amazing. Anyway, that's my point there.
Well, I'm confused because it seems that Republicans genuinely think that they have the midterms in the bag, that they won in 2024. I'm not even going to go there. That's too conspiracy theory right now as we head into the midterms. They won in 2024. You would think that they would understand what they need to be doing heading into this midterm year. They're acting as if they are guaranteed wins across the board. They're ignoring the trends that we've seen in the special elections in November, the gains that we saw with Afton Bain, the Miami mayor's race, the Georgetown City Council race in South Carolina, how they flipped the entire city council and city level government from Republican to Democrat. They're ignoring all of these trends. The Public Service Commission in Georgia, flipping it from Republican to Democrat. They're ignoring all of these trends, and yet they're doing these things that he promised that he would not do on the campaign trail, that people voted for him because they believed that he was being truthful when he was speaking. Genuinely, they genuinely believed him that he was going to end forever wars. He wasn't going to get involved in these conflicts abroad, that regime change conflicts are bad. And yet he is doing all of that in a midterm year. It blows my mind because I cannot wrap my mind around the why behind it. Like what do they think is going to happen? Like people, their student loans are there. People who can't afford their student loans, their wages are starting to get garnished this month on top of their health insurance costs, in some cases quadrupling. And yet we're going to kidnap the president of Venezuela. Like that's where we are on policy in America. Like that's what we care about.
Yeah. So this is why I mentioned a minute ago that I think Venezuela is a very particular choice because it has historically not been a very popular cause in the United States. It's not contentious in the way that some foreign entanglements would be or have been. I mean, Israel and Gaza is an example of one of those contentious debates. Russia, Ukraine is an example of one of those contentious debates. Venezuela is not quite as contentious as that because I think by and large in the public consciousness in the United States, Venezuela has been portrayed as a cut and dry villain somehow, some way for decades now.
Yeah.
And there's not a convenient, hero that or, alternative party in the equation that can be brought in to make it contentious. I mean, the Republican base has, prioritized immigration reform and, stopping immigration and deportation. And Venezuela has been kind of the boogeyman of that because of the drug trade there. Allegedly it's producing this wave of immigrants coming up to the United States. And so if Trump was going to pick a nation to do this to, Venezuela is probably the safest bet as far as politics goes, because there are very few sympathizers with the Venezuelan cause in the United States right now, especially in the conversation of other global international conflicts like Israel and Gaza, like Russia and Ukraine. I think there's a lot of people, progressives who are just more focused on those things and up until now have not really been paying all that much attention to the Venezuelan issue until the past couple of weeks. And even then, it's probably number 2 or 3 on their list of things that they're worried about on a foreign policy front.
Yeah. It almost seems like it's like we're going to catch you off guard because there is no message that the Democratic Party is coalesced behind. And I think that was very evident today because the message was, while we agree that the president was illegitimate, we invaded a sovereign country without congressional approval. It's like, okay, well, they've been doing that since 2001 and nothing's come of it. So like, come up with a better argument, come up with a better talking point. And if it was Israel, if it was Ukraine, if it was Gaza, if it was Russia, I feel as if there are definitive talking points to your point that would strike an emotion with people. But this one was just like we're going to catch them off guard because they don't have messaging. They don't have platforms for Venezuela yet.
Mm. Well, and this actually goes back much further than 2001 as far as like regime change interventions. This is the first time in a long time that it's been so out in the open. If you watch the documentary Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat that came out either a year ago or 2 years ago, Oscar-nominated documentary, it talks about CIA involvement in where I can't remember. I think maybe the Congo might have been where that was in the United States involvement in regime change, but it wasn't just Congo. It was all over Africa. Of course, this has happened in South America before. So this is actually not that unprecedented. It's just unprecedented in the sense that the president is taking credit for it.
Yeah, because even with Bush and Iraq, they were very careful not to say regime change. They did not want the American public to think that that was a regime change war. So weapons of mass destruction, 9/11, all of that justified why they went over into Iraq. But they would always dispel regime change, even though it was very much about Saddam Hussein and regime change. But anyways, yeah, you're not wrong about any of that. I'm interested to see how this continues. If Democrats do coalesce behind a message that resonates with people, that they're focusing on the wrong things, they're not focusing on the things that affect you here at home, or if they just continue on with they didn't seek congressional approval, and that's just where
that gets into the issue of constitutional law, which most Americans very rarely ever get all that fired up about, because that becomes esoteric and academic at that point, where it's like, did he have the authority to do it according to the Constitution in Section 1 or whatever? And that just gets a bit tedious and doesn't really get people to rallies or get people to protest or get people, at least not on a sustained basis. And so I would say the second thing I'm not wrong about is this is probably not really going to matter all that much later in the year from a politics and voting perspective. I think the shutdown, for example, is going to be far more important, especially considering this one was so extended and caused such disruption in a part of the population where shutdowns usually don't touch. And so I remember saying in November, because I did some traveling in November, and the airline situation and the airport situation was such a cluster.
Oh, it was bad.
That I remember saying, this shutdown is different because this is the first shutdown that really affects the upper middle class and the upper class. And part of the reason why this one's going to be different is because it's showing people for the first time in a long time just how dependent on government services they are. A lot of people in their head think, okay, well, I'm not on Medicaid. I'm not on SNAP. I'm not on welfare or anything like that. I'm not, using Medicare yet. I'm not on Social Security yet. So I don't really depend on the government. It's not really a big part of my life in any way. But this one started to have a much larger ripple effect to parts of the population that it ordinarily doesn't touch. Yeah. And now I think people are going to take it very seriously from here on out when a government shutdown rolls around. It's like, okay, well, I didn't realize just how important it was for the government to be around so that there was seamless travel during holiday season, or I could go to the local park without it being closed, or these other, varied and sundry services that all of a sudden people weren't able to access in parts of the population who ordinarily wouldn't be touched by a shutdown.
Yep.
So I think that's a huge deal. And I think just general economic concerns are again going to be the top concern for these midterm elections. I'm a little bit relieved at the fact that some of these economic concerns have gotten so pronounced that I don't think your typical kind of culture wars wedge issues are going to play as significant a role as they did in 2024 or even 2022 and 2020. Like, I really just don't think people are going to continue to buy that line that, like, all your problems are caused by immigrants and trans people and, the stuff like that had been effective.
Yeah.
And now that Roe versus Wade is overturned, that's no longer as effective a wedge issue either, because for a lot of Republicans, their big goal, overturning Roe versus Wade, has now mostly been achieved. I mean, it was overturned, but like there's still disparate state regulations that they can battle, but the big one has now been achieved. And so that as a wedge issue doesn't have the galvanizing effect that it once did.
I feel like to that point, the one thing that the Republican Party has done a really good job of is, and I don't give a shit if this is offensive. They've really dumbed down their base to the point where if you want to win an election in a place like Alabama, all you have to do is have an elephant on your sign. They've removed the ability for people to have to think or to think logically or strategically about who they're going to vote for. So with Roe v. Wade, the way it was messaged was just Roe v. Wade, pro-life, babies, killing babies is bad, therefore we need to overturn Roe v. Wade. That's as deep as that message went. It was overturned. The general Republican population, I feel like, is not thinking about the other aspects of what the Republican agenda is now, with contraception, with controlling women's bodies even further than they already are. You're now getting into the minute details that people can't really comprehend or think about that deeply because they haven't had to exercise that part of their brain because their party has conditioned them to only see Roe v. Wade, pro-life, babies. There you go. Just to piggyback on what you're saying there.
You know what all that is that you just described? Cognitive schema.
See, I was going to bring up cognitive schema later on in the episode, but since we are here now, I want you to explain to people what cognitive schema, what that is, and then why MAGA is a cognitive disorder on this podcast. And because we have a lot of new listeners as of recently. They didn't listen to the first few episodes of He's Not Wrong. They might have missed it. If they don't follow me on TikTok or Instagram, they might not see it. My belief in every fiber of my being, deeply in my soul, I believe that MAGA is a disease. Point blank, period. If you are not capable of, criticizing your own political party, we have a problem.
So Chad said this to me yesterday, and I, being very professorial and trying to be precise, I said it's not quite as accurate to say that it's a disease so much as it is potentially a cognitive disorder based on a theory of cognitive schema. And I would qualify that this would affect any political position or, political movement wherein its adherents exist solely in echo chambers.
Yep.
So, there are certain people in the far right, of course, that might have tipped into, so far into a particular viewpoint or perspective and echo chamber that they may have disordered thinking. But it's also possible for people on the far left or any other type of political persuasion to fall into this trap. And part of what cognitive schema is there neural pathways that form in your brain to help you process information more quickly, that help you with organizing your thoughts, that help you with memory and recall. These are cognitive schema. And so the more that you're exposed to an echo chamber, the more you're building these cognitive schema around certain perspectives and viewpoints and ways of thinking that almost become reflexive to a point. And so if you're building cognitive schema around things that are wrong, then all of a sudden your brain processes wrong information more quickly than it does correct information. And it's what allows you to lean into a lot of irrational thinking without kind of being self-aware of it or even understanding the illogic of it. So cognitive schema is what explains a lot of implicit bias, right? So, we're not born thinking negative things about people who are different from us. It's things that we've absorbed over time, and that's the cognitive schema at work.
Let's unpack that. People aren't born racist. They're taught to be racist. Or
sexist or ageist or, whatever. Here's a very innocuous example, since I mentioned ageist, for example. How when we are introduced to someone who's much older than we are, we have a tendency to speak louder because we're assuming that they're hard of hearing or whatever. We do the same thing with people who don't speak the same language as us, or at least if they have a heavily accented way of speaking our language. We tend to start to speak up and louder and more slowly. That's cognitive schema at work. So it's meant to help you get through day-to-day routine tasks more efficiently without having to puzzle over every single step you take. But that over time, certain adverse effects come from those cognitive schema if you're learning the wrong information and you're developing those schema around it. So with implicit bias, for example, you have to unlearn, you have to unwind those schema and rebuild them again. So anyway, all that to say is when Chad brought up the disease versus disorder thing, I was like, you could potentially make the claim that an extremist faction of a political movement could have disordered cognitive thinking. And one of the ways that you get out of that disordered thinking is through cognitive dissonance, where you're having to reconcile two disparate or different positions and, relearn something new. And that's part of why it's so important to be outside of echo chambers, because if you're in an echo chamber, you don't get cognitive dissonance. You're only confirming your existing biases. Whereas if you get out of the echo chamber, you're exposing yourself to cognitive dissonance, and it's forcing your brain to grow in different ways and learn in different ways.
And that's why my episode with Afton Bain a few weeks ago, the title was Planting Seeds of Dissonance. That her election, or her loss in the election in Tennessee's special election in the 7th Congressional District, it had massive implications nationally. And it had a lot of attention on a very ruby red district in Tennessee. They flipped it, or they didn't flip it, but they turned the district about 14 points in Democrats' favor from the previous election, where Trump was plus 22. So people weren't fully there yet to elect a Democrat, but they made massive gains. And so what is the goal moving forward? You got to plant the seeds of dissonance. You have to be the voice that's giving people the alternative to what they're hearing in their echo chamber. So just to shed light, if you haven't listened to the episode yet, go listen to it. If you have, to give a little context and background into why we named that episode Planting Seeds of Dissonance, because we are really hoping that the information that she was sharing and talking about will counter what people are often hearing in her district.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was actually going to say, because Chad had sent me a list of publications that he was potentially going to read and feature on this podcast in the future based on a catalog for 2026 sent from MIT Press. And one of his former guests, Cass Sunstein, has actually written a book that's coming out that is going to talk a little bit about, bias and how bias forms in echo chambers and that sort of thing. And then there's also another title on this list called The Bias That Divides Us by, sorry, I have to look at my phone, Keith Stanovich, The Science and Politics of My Side Thinking. I think you're going to hear a lot about this in the coming year, this kind of echo chamber effect, especially in conversation with AI, because one of the things that AI does is exacerbate that echo chamber, because it's based on algorithms of your past behaviors and what you're interested in and what it thinks you want to know and see and hear. And so if you're not consciously going against the grain, you're going to be sucked in even further. So you really have to make a conscious effort to kind of course correct on that vein. Let that be a New Year's resolution. It's like, I'm going to make a conscious effort to try to get out of my own personal echo chambers a little bit and just hear what's going on outside of my own bubble. And that goes for wherever you are on the political spectrum. I think it's helpful for everyone to be that way, if for no other reason than to just be aware of what other perspectives are out there. Sometimes it may reinforce what you already believe, but at least you're knowledgeable of what exists beyond your own frame of reference.
Benjamin, can I share with you what I'm not wrong about?
Sure.
So this is going to be a pivot, and it's going to be a little off base for some of you, but I'm not wrong that dead people don't deserve motorcades. And yeah, you're looking at me and you're trying not to laugh and you're taking a sip of your wine, but we live on a one-way street and people drive insane. It's loud, and there's a church down the street. And I just think that people that are dead don't deserve motorcades paid for by taxpayer dollars because they are dead. They do not know that they're getting special treatment. It is disruptive. I record this podcast in the second bedroom of my apartment that I've turned into a studio. It is a city apartment. We hear everything on the outside. If I know anything, it's that dead person is probably not wanting to disrupt my life any further than they might have when they were alive. So they don't need motorcades. I don't agree with that. Just the other day, Taylor was really excited because after the Doug Jones kickoff event that we went to, it was on a Friday night. The next morning, there was a massive motorcade going down the street, and he thought it was some big official. He thought it might have been Doug Jones. And I just looked out the window and I said, no, that's a funeral procession. And just the day before that, I did a list of things that I'm not wrong about on my TikTok. And on that list was dead people don't deserve motorcades. They're dead. They don't know they're getting the special treatment. It happened again a few days ago. And so it's top of mind right now for me. And I just really want to hammer in the fact that if you die, please write out of your will the need for a motorcade, because it is just, I think, irresponsible. It's rude and it's not necessary. What are your thoughts on that, Benjamin?
I have to say, I don't really have many thoughts about this other than to say when I'm dead, I'm sure I won't care. I mean, I don't really care about legacy. A lot of people get very caught up in legacy and leaving an heir. I've never really thought much about that because
you want to be the one receiving it from an heir.
Yeah. Or well, yes, of course I would like inheritance, but what I mean is storing up, esteem for later. I don't, or being so concerned with how you're going to be perceived on down through the ages. That really doesn't appeal to me. Mm-hmm. Or it's something that I even aspire to. For example, I've written a book. I'm working on a second one. And
I am in your first book.
Yes, if you want to admit that, you are. But I can't say that. But all that to say is, a lot of times writers get very wrapped up in oh, I need to make this timeless. I need to make sure this is timeless and that people are concerned, want to read this for years and hundreds of years. And I'm thinking, I'll never know if they do or not. I would rather it be relevant to the people who are living now than to be something that people discover, 300 years from now and all of a sudden fall in love with. I mean, if that happens, great. But like, I'm not going to be concerned with trying to make it timeless like that. Like one of the things that you'll learn in a creative writing class, for example, is you shouldn't do a lot of cultural references that are, because that's going to take away from the timeless quality of your work. And I'm just like, whatever. I don't really care if it's relevant 100 years from now. I care that it's relevant now.
I cannot stand in music videos and movies. I hate, and I've always said this, hate with a capital, hate seeing people with iPhones or technology. I cannot stand it. Like, I don't want the actor to answer a phone call. I don't want them to stop on a street corner to take out an iPhone to send a text message. I don't want them to tap to pay. Like it takes me out of the universe that they're in. I want it to have a timeless aspect to it, but I don't want the feeling that I have when I'm watching that show or I'm watching that movie or I'm reading that book in that moment to be aged if I revisit it 10 years from now, because we don't know if tap to pay is going to be a popular thing. Why, like, let's not age it. Let's not do that.
I mean, I think it depends on the genre and the context, but like comedy lives or dies by its precision and its relevance to the moment. Like so much. And I try to be funny, whether I succeed or not is for the audience to decide. But the best comedy is always poking at what the moment is about. So like, especially political comedy, because political comedians are by default weighing in on what's happening in the moment. And if they're not, then what's the point of having political comedy at all? So I think it just depends on the context and the genre that you're working in. But all that to say is your point about the motorcade.
So
I won't care if I have a motorcade or not.
Well, will you promise on the He's Not Wrong podcast right now that when you pass, you won't have a motorcade? Can you make that?
I can't let my fans down. If that's what they want to do, I'm not going to stop them.
I'm disappointed in you, Benjamin.
All 2 cars that'll be in the motorcade.
So one reason why I wanted to have you on for the introduction that has now turned into a full-on episode was I wanted to look back at 2025. I wanted your thoughts on the growth of the podcast, your thoughts on the guests that we've had, and what as I will call you an occasional viewer.
Yes.
Yeah, occasional viewer. I think that's pretty generous. As an occasional viewer of the podcast, what you would like to get out of it in 2026. So I want to start with looking back at 2025 and just get your overall thoughts on He's Not Wrong, since it had began in March of last year.
Yeah. So like, I'm probably the worst person on earth to ask about this because I am one of the Luddite teens. If you've heard of the Luddite teen movement, I'm like its spiritual godmother in many ways because I've been living the Luddite teen experience for like 20 years now. I am the last person to adopt any technology or new media moment. Until about a year ago, I don't think I'd ever actually listened to a podcast. I didn't really know how to access them. Like I didn't know there was an app just to access podcast. I had no idea. And even now, if there's a podcast episode that I want to tune into, I go to YouTube to do it. I still don't really know how to access podcasts any other way. So I'm very much a person that would rather just like read the transcript or read like some printout text. We were like, just as an example too, we were like 20 full ass years into the Kindle before I got one. And even then, it's a love-hate relationship that I have.
I would argue that's what makes you the perfect person to ask this question, because you are not, and I'm being so honest, like you're a target guest, but you're not target audience. And the fact that you have paid attention and you know at least somewhat what's going on He's Not Wrong, you know somewhat of the guests that we're having on and the conversations that we're having, makes you the perfect person to ask that question.
So I've been exposed a little bit more to podcasts in general, this one as well as others. Usually if I tune into the He's Not Wrong podcast, it's because I recognize who the guest is, like Cass Sunstein. I recognize who he is because his wife is Samantha Power, and I'm a big fan of Samantha Power. She's a journalist, scholar, was the United States ambassador to the United Nations under Obama, as well as the head of USAID before it was dismantled. I've read both of her books. She's very great. So I recognized who Cass Sunstein was and that he was a professor at Harvard and everything. So I tuned into that episode. So usually I'm tuning in if I recognize who the person is. One of the things I do like about podcasts is that you get a sense of it being a bit unfiltered with the guests. You know, like if you're watching a 60 Minutes interview with someone like Cass Sunstein, for example, because that's the kind of thing he would ordinarily have been part of, you're only really going to get maybe 4 or 5 questions in the little package that they put together for the show. Whereas in a podcast, you're getting a deep dive into what that person is thinking or doing and at that time, and to the work that they're putting out there at that particular moment. It's not a retrospective, but it can be. I don't know. I really like that kind of immersive, loose quality to it, especially on podcasts where the host genuinely seems interested in the person that's there. And it's not just they're having them there because they're famous or whatever.
Yep.
And you can always tell the difference because of the quality of questions being asked. So I will say this about the He's Not Wrong podcast is it has a very consistent stream of people. I think at first I thought like He's Not Wrong as a title comes across as being much more playful. It's ended up being a much more serious, kind of intellectually hefty podcast than I expected. I thought it was going to be a bit more of like, I don't know, playing around, telling jokes, talking about pop culture, a little politics, because I know Chad and he has a background in public administration and nonprofit and running and, you know, being involved in politics. So I thought there would be a part of that, but it's been much more of a focus and it's been much more serious than I anticipated it was going to be. And the first time that I was on was towards the beginning. I mean, I don't think you'd even been around for like 2 months by that point.
Yeah.
And that episode was definitely playful. And you could tell the expectations I had because I rolled up on set with a bottle of wine then, which is why we have it again now.
Yep.
I perform better when I've had a little bit to drink. Otherwise, I would just sit here and not say much.
I appreciate all of that. I think when this podcast began, I wanted it to be a mix of pop culture and comedy and politics. And there was definitely a desire to be funny, to talk about pop culture in a way that resonated with people, like finding that viral moment in order to be able to grow. As vain as that sounds, I was very much inspired by Heather McMahon, who's a comedian. I was very much inspired by Jonathan Van Ness with Getting Curious. I was obviously inspired by the I've Had It ladies, Jennifer Welch and Angie Pumps. I've been listening to them since day one in October of 2022. And so there was just like all these different things in the podcast universe that were inspiring me. And it did take a minute to find that groove. My secret weapon is my boyfriend, Taylor, who is my executive producer for He's Not Wrong. So many of the guests in the direction that this podcast has gone has been because he has believed in what we are doing. He's believed in the potential that it has, and he has seen what people have responded to. And what people have responded to is when we do talk about politics, when we do bring on guests who are experts in their area and we deep dive into their body of work. For instance, we just had Sarah Mosliner come on and she wrote a book. She's a professor in Michigan, and she wrote a book about purity culture and how purity culture breeds at a young age Christian nationalism and how that is a big part of the Republican MAGA movement. And that was one of my most listened to episodes. And so to your point, yeah, in the beginning, it was a little confusing for everyone. He's Not Wrong was very much like, as we just did, I'm not wrong that dead people don't need a motorcade. But I'm also not wrong that people like Sarah need a platform to share their work and the importance of their research when it comes to purity culture and the damage that it has on young women, and how people live with the consequences of that for the rest of their lives, and it takes extensive therapy to get through the harm that the church imposes on a lot of people. So I'm really appreciative that people have stuck with us, that they've listened, that our guests have agreed to come on, that you've agreed to come on twice. I tell people, for the guests that I've had come on twice, I say, if you come on twice, you're a correspondent. So Benjamin is now a he's not wrong correspondent. I plan on making in the next week or so, a page on my website of my correspondence. I am. Your headshot's going to go on my website.
I should be out in the field.
Yes, exactly. That's why I have the setup that I have, so I can have my guests in the field. But all that to say, I appreciate that. It has been a growing journey.
Well, one of the interesting things about podcasts in general is that, especially when one is starting to kind of take off and you get interest from bigger names like Aaron Parnas, who's already a very established figure, who's usually on like CNN or places like that. I like that a podcast, just as it's taking off, is still getting that mix of like smaller name people who have a lot of things that are important to say, such as the book you just mentioned on purity culture. Like that's the type of person who's expert in what she's doing, but who may not be profiled on, Good Morning America.
Yeah.
But you're also capturing a lot of the bigger established names as well. And I think in general, that's how podcasts tend to go. And one of the real selling points about podcasts that nobody brings up, and I'm going to refer to like, that song from the 80s, Video Killed the Radio Star, because it can be a visual medium, but since it is not first and foremost a visual medium, there's no pressure to get glam, right? And so there is space for a more intellectual, immersive conversation to take place, because you're not having to worry as much about like, what are the guests wearing? Are they made up? Do they have a glam team? What the background is looking like. I mean, you're watching us probably right now, but a lot of podcasts are primarily audio. And so I like that it's kind of relieved the pressure, to have a certain look among guests. Because like on a morning show on TV, serious thinking people are probably not going to be invited, because they're not going to show up and look glitzy and glamorous and everything, which is what a morning show wants. It's not effervescent. So I do appreciate podcasts in general being that way, and that it's really kind of training people to have a taste for deep dive conversations again, in a way that a regular news format TV show is not going to give you. Every podcast that I've subsequently listened to since this one started, the one I listen to most is Dua Lipa's literature one, by the way.
So good.
And the fact that Dua Lipa is getting people interested in reading like Margaret Atwood and people like that is a huge deal to me. But it's like, it's training people to want to have that immersive deep dive conversation again and really learn the nuance behind a lot of these topics, not just the hot takes. That's something I've lamented about our culture for a long time, is that a lot of the people who get the most attention are basically just giving you hot takes. They're not really giving you anything in depth. And thus most people, if that's all they consume, they're really not that informed.
Yeah. And I will say my number one complaint, and I said this early on when I launched He's Not Wrong, again, said it on Instagram, said it on TikTok, said it in earlier episodes. I hate that this is a video format. I hate that I have to clip this for social media. And honestly, I've quit clipping my podcast episodes for social media, because if you like me on TikTok, I hope you like me enough to listen to the podcast. And then this can live in its own space. I don't want to dumb down the conversation into a 4-second soundbite on TikTok. It feels disingenuous to me. So I don't like the fact that I have to record this, but I do, because it's what the standard is. And I've honestly have had fun figuring out the the proper background format, whatever. But I want to talk about Aaron Parnas a little bit because you brought him up, and I am so grateful that the podcast has grown to a point where someone like Aaron would agree to come onto this podcast. Aaron now, I believe, is approaching 10 million followers across all platforms. Massive on Substack, massive on Instagram, massive on TikTok, huge following on Threads. People go to him. If you listen to the episode, you're aware. If you haven't yet, please do go listen to it. But people go to him because he's independent media. He is very quick. He gives information in a way that people can digest and still go about their day. They know what's going on. If they need to go research a little bit more because something is of interest to them, they have the resources and the tools necessary through him to do so. So I am so happy that he came on the podcast. He was so kind. Every clip, I will say that episode I did clip and put out on social media because the information was deep and it was thorough, and I didn't just do sound bites. I did full thoughts, and he promoted every single one of those clips, and the exposure that he gave, he's not wrong. I mean, it's invaluable. If you put a dollar amount to it, I would not be able to afford what he gave. He's not wrong. So he was very kind. He's very generous with his platform, and he believes very much that the Democratic Party needs to continue investing in an influencer infrastructure as to be able to compete with the one that the Republican Party has implemented. And that's it's constant posting, it's constant information, it's supporting each other.
Well, I think this is an important lesson. One of the things I talk about at work, and I will say, I work in technology consulting, although my appearance today is not in any way reflective of that. These are all my own opinions.
You kind of blend in. Your shirt kind of blends in with the background.
Yeah, I already said I look like I'm on the moon. Even though we're sitting in the same room, Chad's background looks completely different from mine. Anyway, what I was saying is one of the things that we've talked about in my professional life is the attention economy and how it's very hard to really craft and disseminate a unified, clear core message. And so as a result, you have to do a lot of what you were just talking about with as far as Aaron's example of going on to podcasts that are like up and coming, hitting new media types, because I will be candid. When he came on this podcast, I was like, why is he coming on this podcast? Like, good for you that you got him, but I was just like, I don't understand what's in it for him. Like, he already has enough of a profile of his own.
Because Aaron is kind.
But all that to say is the way to survive in the attention economy is to not think you're above a certain media type. The marketplace is so fractured now that just going on CNN or MS Now, always be MSNBC to me, but MS Now or something like that really isn't going to get you the exposure it would have 10, 20 years ago. So to build your own audience as a thought influencer, you really have to spread yourself across a variety of different platforms and shows and formats in order to be heard. And I do think it's important for the Democratic Party to understand that. I think the Democratic Party has gotten a little bit complacent that a lot of legacy media outlets are usually pretty willing to give them an ear. But the legacy media outlets collectively are really only going to get you a sliver of the population's attention anymore. So you have to have that more grassroots strategy doing things like this in order to be heard at a large scale. But the central point being there's not, some monolithic media entity like there was in the 1980s, where if you just went on 60 Minutes, half the nation would hear you.
And I want to speak to that a little bit with Aaron before we move on, because to give that a little bit of grit, what he just said, a little bit of fact and number. It's not all that's not a theory. That is fact. Because one thing that Aaron posted the other day was that he is the 5th most watched news political channel in the country. So I will read to you the top 10. So number 1 is Daily Mail. Number 2 is Fox News. Number 3 is The Shade Room. I've never heard of The Shade Room.
I know what The Shade Room is.
It says it's neutral. Is that true?
Left leaning.
Okay. Number 4 is NBC News. It says neutral. I know that's left leaning. And then number 5 is Aaron Parnas with over 554 million total engagements. Number 6 is CBS News. Shockingly, number 7 is The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. But number 9 is CNN and number 10 is BBC News. So more people listen to and engage with Aaron Parnas than they do CNN and BBC.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I just want to hit home the fact that the fact that he came on here and he gave us his time and he promoted this podcast, it says a lot about who he is. And I am so appreciative to him for what he has given to He's Not Wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So in that vein, I want to ask you, what do you want to get out of this podcast in 2026, Benjamin? What are you looking forward to? What do you hope? Where do you hope this goes?
I'm really excited to see this podcast exist in an actual election year. 2025. I mean, 2024 was a big election year globally. Like, I forget, billions of people across the globe voted in 2024. 2026 is not going to be quite that big, but it is still pretty significant in the United States, at least.
It'll be a higher turnout midterm for sure.
And in the state of Alabama, it's a big year. So to see a political podcast go through its first like actual election year is going to be important. I think the important thing for you is going to be doing more, at least attempting to try to do more kind of breaking news reporting. Most podcasts are not breaking news reporting podcasts. They're commenting on the news of the day, but they're not breaking the news.
Yeah.
I think it would be nice, which is possible because such a big focus of this podcast is Alabama politics, which gives you much more space to break news than if you were trying to weigh in on national politics. So that'll be interesting. I'm hoping to see some maybe exclusives or first to the plate stories in 2026, which I think is going to be possible to do, but does take a little bit more work, relying on a network of people who've either been on the show or watched the show to give you tips or some connections or whatever to get to that story first. It's going to be very hard, but that's really a way to distinguish this podcast from other ones. I'm trying to think what else in 2026.
Well, I will say on the social media following, to give a little behind the scenes of how all of this got started, was most podcasts, they have their podcasts and the social media accounts is solely promotion. It's like we said, the soundbite clips from an episode. And I didn't want to do that. My TikTok is its own content. That you go to TikTok to get one thing. And we've amassed a following there. We're building a following on Instagram. If you want different content, follow on Instagram. So if you follow on TikTok and you want to follow on Instagram, you're getting a variety of content. So there is something for you on every channel. And then the podcast itself is its own thing. And if you like the short form content on those platforms, then the podcast is going to allow you to go deeper into subject matter on whatever it is. And so we are in a place to do exactly what you just said. I'm excited for it. We have a lot of political guests that are lined up over this first term of the year. And that's one thing that I wanted to do with this episode, being the first one in 2026, was kind of lay out what people can expect in 2026, being a midterm year. Number one, we have a lot of candidates who are coming on. We're going to follow a lot of people before their primary, and then we're going to follow them after the primary, going to the general in November. For instance, we're filming with Doug Jones on Tuesday. We're one of his first podcasts of 2026 that he's coming on to record with us. Really excited about that one. And so yeah, there will be a lot of political content, even more so than what people are used to in the previous year, in the upcoming year. And then we also will be expanding, big announcement, to Substack. So please go to my link tree and subscribe to my Substack, because there is so much content that we talk about with our guests.
Let me clarify something
Please.
while we're on the topic of Substack, because Substack, you do have to subscribe to the person you're following. So if you're going to subscribe to this podcast, you do have to have a profile. But in my experience with Substack, a lot of people think, oh, I've got to subscribe. That's going to cost money.
No.
It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to spend money to subscribe. A lot of them are free. So like, don't be scared by that. You know, you've got to create a Substack profile and, you know, formally subscribe to the thing. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have money. So like, get on Substack, look at all the different things and creators on there, and look at a lot of different stuff. I mean, that's often where breaking news is happening, because people can put content on there much more quickly than it's going to appear in print media.
Yeah, free. I'm not looking to charge people for that. We're building community. We are trying to share our lived experiences. We're trying to learn from each other and build community. I'm not charging for the Substack. It is free. So as Benjamin said, please make a Substack, subscribe, because it will allow me to not only post these podcast episodes, but give a deeper profile into my guests, into their body of work, into parts of the conversation that we might not have been able to release in an episode, but we can give full context and background on Substack. So think of Substack as a complementary outlet to the podcast, video and audio.
Since you brought up a Substack, one thing I would hope from this podcast, which I think a more locally situated podcast is best positioned to do, is to be a bit more ethnographic. And that's a very scholarly term. So let me explain what that means. Ethnographic means like you're capturing a holistic view of a particular place, a particular setting, a particular people or group of people. And so like one of the things that the rest of the country often gets wrong about Alabama is that it's wholly red, right? That it's this bastion of far-right conservatism. And it's actually not really the case. I mean, you just mentioned Doug Jones going to be here on Tuesday. Doug Jones has won a statewide election in this state before, and it surprised people. And I think one of the things that this podcast can do is help kind of correct that perception that there are no progressive-minded people here, or that they don't have any influence, or that everybody here is dumb, or, you know, two-toothed hicks that have no concern for what's going on in the world. And so providing that kind of course-correcting perspective on what life is really like here, I think is going to be beneficial.
Yeah.
From an ethnographic perspective. So, and that goes beyond just politics, like what's going on in the state beyond just the political discussion, the creative discussion. I mean, I bet you if you asked people on a national level, like what kind of creative energy is going on down here, they wouldn't be able to name anything going on except maybe the Alabama Shakes.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, there's a lot more to life down here. And, you know, we were talking about polling recently and like polls getting it wrong and how do you know, and getting a representative sample of the population. One of the things that polls consistently got wrong, particularly in 2016, was the appetite for a candidate like Donald Trump. And if you were someone that lived down here the whole time, on election night in 2016, when everyone else's jaw was on the floor, we were all down here like, yeah, well,
Shock.
we're not surprised by this. But part of that not being surprised is that it's a deep exposure into why people might have found that appealing, even if it didn't make sense. And it's very important for, I think, the political status quo in this country to get a better sense of that part of the population so that they don't underestimate it or underestimate the extent that that sentiment exists. And one of the things that's so important, and this is something I'm not wrong about, is that
Let's hear it.
A social phenomenon is that a lot of people who vote on political extremes on both ends of the political spectrum recognize what's socially acceptable to actually purport to be. most people are not going to outright say, I'm a communist or a Marxist or whatever bad thing that is, label you can assign to the far left. No one's going to outright admit, I'm kind of dabbling in Nazism, or I believe in deporting anyone that's not white, or whatever the case may be, anyone that's not Christian, whatever the case may be on the far right. They may believe that, but they're savvy enough to understand that it's not socially acceptable to say it. So when they're called by a polling organization like Gallup and asked point blank, did you vote this way or do you believe this way? They actually know better than to say yes. And that's why a lot of political polling gets it wrong, because there's no real way to get around that, social acceptability answer. And part of the reason why I know that this is the case is because I've spent so many years teaching in a school of education where my students know better than to say, oh, well, I don't want this type of student in my class, or if this student was in my class, I'm not going to help them, or I'm not interested in helping special education students. I'm not interested in, boosting girls' ability or sense of self-worth. I'm not interested in those things. I'm a very culturally responsive teacher. They know that that's what they should say. And then you go and actually do observations and you realize they don't call on brown students, or they know nothing about working with students who need accommodations. They don't provide accommodations. So we know that people are very actually self-aware that what they believe probably they shouldn't, but they do anyway. And so that's why a lot of political polling gets it wrong. All that to say is the political status quo in this country would do themselves a huge favor if they got to know the parts of the country that feel the way that they do and vote the way that they do, even if they tell pollsters something different, so that you're not caught by surprise anymore and you can form a strategy that's more effective for that.
And exactly what you said, I hope he's not wrong, can help bridge that gap, because it is so important. And I mean, you segued into what my final question for you, what it is so beautifully and perfectly, because I wanted to discuss research and polling and where people can go to get accurate information. If we're going to plant seeds of dissonance, and if we're going to try to point people to the websites that they need to be on, looking for accurate information, reputable information that might make them think or dig a little deeper into a topic, I want to know what those are, and I want to share those with people. So, Benjamin.
So, first of all, the thing that I always tell people, and this is probably not the best format in which to say this, but you're much better off in general reading your news, at least a significant chunk of it.
And that makes sense. I had MS Now on the TV last night, and he quickly gave me a reality check on that. So go deeper.
All that
into
to say
it.
is you're more easily manipulated the more senses are engaged when you're consuming a media product. So if you'll notice, Fox News in particular has the big, the music that in the flashing red and yellow, breaking news, Fox News alert, and it's loud, and they're, it's an overwhelming kind of multi-sensory experience when you watch it, which is why it's so effective with its audience, because it's easier to manipulate someone through music. I mean, that's why horror movies can be so effective at creating tension, as they've got the score, they get the flashing lights, all that kind of stuff. So if you read the news, you're only being engaged via the text. You're not getting the sound. You're not getting the kind of traumatic visuals or things like that. And so you're much less emotionally involved and much more intellectually involved. And so as far as getting accurate information, you can certainly find text-based information that's not accurate, but it's less, the bad is less likely to manipulate you into believing something you shouldn't be believing in because it's written down. So I would say that. But one of the things that I refer to all the time is the Pew Research Center and the surveys that they do. They do a lot of longitudinal surveys.
And what does that mean for the people who are listening?
Longitudinal means it's ongoing. Like they'll do a survey in 2025, for example, and they'll do another one in 5 years on the exact same questions, exact same like age group. So they're tracking the development of the phenomenon over an extended period of time. So like they do the religious landscape study, I think on a cadence of every 5 years, maybe 10. They do one about LGBTQ Americans. They do one about like social media habits, where people get their news, all different kinds. There's so many different subjects. If you go to the Pew Research Center, you can see these surveys all over the place. A recent one that I found interesting was Gen Z and technology usage. And that one's interesting in that we tend to assume that Gen Z is very on board with emerging technology and they're easily adaptable to technology and, you know, all this kind of stuff. But what that survey revealed is there's a healthy dose of skepticism, particularly with AI. And they get, because Pew Research Center is able to get a national level sample size, it's pretty reputable because they can get, you know, respondents in the thousands and thousands. So, and they're very careful about getting a representative sample, and you see the breakdown and all their data and things like that. So I love the Pew Research Center. They're nonpartisan. You know, they do some political polling, but mostly just to give a finger on the pulse of what's going on. They're not an advocacy organization in the same way that like the Heritage Foundation is a think tank, but it's also an advocacy organization. So it has a very specific agenda that it's trying to accomplish. So there's that. One thing that I would challenge listeners to do is to broaden the scope of the things that they're reading or checking into on a regular basis. I was telling Chad last night, I almost daily am going to tune into the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Economist, the Sloan Management Review out of MIT, the Harvard Business Review, the New Yorker, New York Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, the Council on Foreign Relations newsletter to get a foreign policy look. We have a mutual friend named Carter who's all the time looking at like international newspapers and posting all over his Instagram. But I think that's a good practice, is like seeing what other countries outside the United States are thinking about what's going on in the United States is a very interesting perspective to get. So that might start with looking at The Guardian, the Times, the Financial Times, these, you know, British-based publications that are still going to be in English, still accessible in the United States, but are giving that kind of outsider's perspective about what's going on, because we're probably a little too emotionally involved to really look at news in a neutral perspective, but those are. So I would say do that.
Carter William and I had a international politics class together in college, and we did not have a textbook. We did not have the only readings that we had. Our main course material came from The Economist. So for that semester, to be in that class, we had to subscribe to The Economist. And I mean, it was the most eye-opening thing. And it was one of the greatest classes that I've ever had. And Auburn had an active bomb threat on campus that year. And Carter and I were in the business building in that class. And
was that the guy with the back brace?
Yeah, the back brace. So Auburn,
he was wearing a back brace and someone thought he was wearing a bomb.
Yeah. And so they put the school on shutdown, and it was in the building that Carter and I were in class in. And they went room by room, emptying out the classes. And Carter was he was the editor of the Eagle Eye News. And so they texted him and said, hey, bomb threat, because none of us had the notification yet. News gets the alerts first. So he interrupted the teacher, told us that. We looked in the hallway. Lo and behold, police officers all throughout the hallway. And then they made it to our room, knocked on the door, told us to run. We had to run downstairs. It was one of the scariest moments of my life, all to find out that the guy was wearing a back brace.
Well, that's all cognitive schema. We've been so conditioned as a culture to assume that any type of like unusual looking person might be an active shooter and we best run or call the cops or something. I mean, that's cognitive schema at work.
And he, and he was, the important note here was, I believe he was Middle Eastern descent. He was at a frat party. He jumped from a balcony, broke his back, was in a back brace. So people
he was in a back brace.
People saw someone in a business building, which was majority white people, white folk. They saw a Middle Eastern person wearing a jacket, and it was really bulky. And they assumed that it was a bomb/gun situation, and they were racist.
Yeah, that was
bad.
Interesting time. That was like part of a series of bomb threats that occurred on campus. I guess that's died down. I don't know. I'm not there on a regular basis anymore, but yeah, there was a lot of heightened concern at that like there was like a 3-year stretch where people were very jumpy about that.
Well, Benjamin, we made it to the end of the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on today. How do you feel? Are you happy with how this turned out?
Yes, but you said you were going to ask my resolution and you never did.
Oh my God. What's your resolution?
Oh, so this is a resolution that I dabbled in the latter part of 2025, and I hope others will join me in this. But one of my 2026 resolution is to say, because I'll turn 40, not in 2026, but 2027. So the last year of my 30s, I'm saying yes to things that I ordinarily would not say yes to.
Like losing fingernail polish?
Yeah. That's one that happened at the end of 2025, and that's a story I'm not sharing on this podcast. But things like that, saying yes to things I ordinarily wouldn't say yes to, and also being a bit more forthright with what I think and how I feel around people, being a little less tentative about my real feelings about various subjects and relationships. So oh my God, butchered that one. My resolution for this new year is to continue to grow this podcast, to continue to grow the listenership, to continue to speak truth to power. There are things that are happening to me right now that are active attempts to silence the work that I have poured my blood, sweat, tears, money into. And that's why I'm not sitting in front of a window at his apartment.
I'm in front of the window, beyond these curtains. But I won't be stopped. My goal is to continue to speak truth to power, to continue to grow this podcast, to grow my Substack, to highlight and elevate candidates across this country who have our best interest at heart, and to give them a platform to share their message, to let people know that there are actual people running for office in your local community that cares about you. And that's the essence of this podcast. I always say, rule number 1, I'm not wrong. Rule number 2, being involved locally in your community matters. And I always, always, always ask my guests, not you, but other guests that are running for office and, involved more so in the public arena, what the best avenue is for getting involved locally on the subject matter that they're speaking about. And I want to continue to elevate those individuals because it's so, so important. And as a reminder, it's important because the issues at the local level will affect you before issues at the federal level make its way to your front door. So those are my resolutions. I appreciate you coming on, Benjamin.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have you on again very, very soon. He lives about 1 floor down and 4 doors, 1 floor down and 4 doors down.
I was eating a salad and watching the movie Aliens when he texted me to come upstairs because his guest couldn't be here.
I mean, Benjamin was already going to come on. I just needed him to come on about an hour and a half before call time.
I was already dressed. It was fine.
So if you have something that you're not wrong about that you want to share with the podcast, you can call 205-538-3202. Or you can send me an email at chat@he'snotwrongpodcast.com. You can find us on TikTok at He's Not Wrong, on Instagram at He's Not Wrong Podcast, and officially on Substack at He's Not Wrong. Please go subscribe. We're in this together. We're not backing down. We're only going to go up from here. I appreciate all of you. I'll see you next Sunday.